Jesse Colman, second year MBA student studying finance and social impact. I'm going to introduce Richard a little bit more than the project. He's a humble guy, and I'm going to say some nice things about him. But first, I want to give a big thank you to IMAP. Thank you, Eddie and Susan, for your leadership and for creating an engaging speaker series each year. Deborah, thank you so much for making sure these things go and making sure that they go well. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Nalin Kulatilaka and the Marote Institute for shaping and funding and contributing to the work that Richard is presenting today. So a few comments about Dr. Stuebi. He's spent his career providing leadership and vision in a variety of pockets of the global energy transition. He brings a strategic vision and data-driven mind to the problem of decarbonization. He has been a professor here at Questrom, a consultant on a variety of energy projects throughout the Americas and Africa and around the world, a senior executive at National Grid and Louis Dreyfus, a management and economic consultant with McKinsey and ICF, a venture capitalist in the technology and energy space. He holds degrees from MIT and Stanford, and most recently, he was awarded his PhD by the University of Virginia. And his thesis is fascinating. He's looking at the drivers of US consumer behavior in the household use of electricity, which is a topic very close to my heart. It got me very interested in energy because I find the household energy market is one of the most ubiquitous markets that we think the least about. Maybe not folks in this room, but certainly before learning about it, I never thought about it. And Dr. Stuebi has found some fascinating results about what happens when the utility tells consumers what they think the consumers are about to use in terms of energy. And the consumer behavior with that information about the utility's prediction is fascinating. I'm not going to spoil it, but you should ask Dr. Stuebi what he found. He is a very interesting guy, highly motivated to explore what makes a difference in the lives of humans, especially in our diverse and complex interactions with energy systems. And so to talk about impact measurement for off-grid electricity users in Honduras, please welcome Dr. Richard Stuebi.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm humbled by your introduction. A couple of minor quibbles or corrections to make. My PhD is actually from Virginia Tech, not from the University of Virginia. Excellent school, though it may be. I should give it the proper recognition. And, also to clarify, I was never designated a professor, although fortunately at Questrom, everybody who's on faculty is called professor, which I think is a great tradition. But I don't want to over promote myself. I was a lecturer at Questrom for 4.5 years, and 4.5 of the best years of my career. As is evident from Jesse's introduction, I'm a jack of all trades, but I would also say I'm a master of none. But one thing that does unify everything that I've done relates to the energy sector. And today's talk will be about energy access. Energy access addresses one of the key things that are happening in today's world, which is there are 700 million people in the world today who do not have electricity, and without which they're trapped in a poverty trap, because you can't really get out of poverty without having access to electricity. And vice versa, it's really hard to get access to electricity if you don't have the wealth to afford having electricity brought to you. And this is especially prominent in the rural developing world. Now, over the past 40 or so years, the advent of photovoltaics, solar cells, has become the solar technology, photovoltaics technology is the costs of it have fallen dramatically by about 95 to 99%, depending upon how you measure it, over the past few decades. So it's becoming relatively inexpensive to think about a different type of way of providing electricity, rather than extending the grid, which is extremely capital intensive, to develop and offer kind of small, bite-sized, solar-based solutions. And there's a whole community or nexus of businesses around the world that are doing what is called the energy access business of using solar-based products and solutions. Even so, even though it's much more capital light than extending a grid, These energy access businesses still need capital to grow, of course, and there's just not enough capital going to those energy access businesses to complete the solution of the 700 million people who don't have access to electricity today. Now, to making progress towards closing that gap on capital is the fact that there's an increasing use of blended capital stacks and improving measurement and ability to source more what I think the world is more commonly calling impact capital from impact investors. So that there are financial innovations that are aiding that, but there's still a long way to go. There's still a big gap to be closed. And so the research question that Jesse, Nalin, and I are really interested in is how to unlock more capital and from different sources to close that capital gap. Just to kind of put an emphasis on how important electricity is, high rates of economic activity only happen in countries where more than 95% of the population has electricity. Electrification is an enabler of almost every aspect of participation in the 21st century economy. And while it's possible to, electrify in the developing world, large cities, really you need the whole economy, including the rural areas, to be electrified. And you won't get to a 95% electrification until virtually everybody in society has access to electricity. Until then, the rural life in the rural developing world looks very much like it did 2, 3, 5, 800 years ago for many people, with the exception of the bicycle here in this photo and the plastic bucket and maybe some tin roofs over their heads. These lives are very similar to the lives that were led hundreds of, or not, if not more years ago. And getting into the 21st century just doesn't happen without electrification. So what has emerged with solar powered options are different ways of providing electricity service that aren't reliant upon extending the grid. The way that the energy access community kind of thinks about it is different tiers of service quality. We in the developed world are accustomed and take for granted tier 5, which is an electricity grid where we can use electricity as much as we want and 24 hours a day, and it's always reliable and it's pretty affordable, etc. That's an exceptionally capital intensive network to build. And it's especially daunting to build to extend a grid of a tier 5 quality to rural areas in remote, difficult terrain to customers that don't have a lot of money to spend on it. As a result, the idea of introducing a modicum of electricity service in tier 0 or tier 1 or tier 2, which we'll talk more about in the rest of this lecture, that don't require the capital intensivity of the grid, of the major electricity grid. We're talking about something that's 100 or 1,000 times less electricity per capita than the types of electricity service that we're accustomed to. And correspondingly, the capital requirements of providing tier 1 and tier 2 electricity are, 50, 100, 200, 500 times less capital intensive than extending a grid miles and miles and miles across rough terrain to very poor populations. So the types of products and solutions that we're talking about for the rest of this discussion generally fall into these categories of tier 0, 1, and 2. Tier 0 is a standalone device that can be powered by a little solar cell with a battery. Tier 1, as you can see from this photo, implies putting a solar panel on the roof of a house, and inside you drill a hole in the roof, and inside the house there'll be a couple lights and some ability to charge a cell phone and a radio. And this at least starts to begin to offer some connectivity or some ability to participate in the 21st century economy. Tier 2 is a bigger version of tier one. You have a few panels of solar, which allows then and a larger battery, which allows then to power more than a few lights. You might have a television or a fan or a satellite dish. So the companies that are offering these what are called solar home systems are called energy access businesses. And we were lucky to work with an energy access business this summer that was founded and launched by Questrom alumni. And his name was Richard Hansen. We'll talk more about that as we move forward into this lecture. One of the things, though, that these energy access businesses do still bump up against is the fact that these tier zero, tier one, tier two installations are very capital intensive for not for you and me maybe, but for people who are in these economies then and living, to use the C.K. Prahalad phrase, at the bottom of the pyramid, very, very low income populations. You'll see here this dotted blue line. Lloro is the state in Honduras that we visited, Jesse and I did this summer. And the per capita income on a monthly basis in Lloro is $200 a month. Now that's in the whole state. If you actually, and that includes some reasonably sized municipalities. If you go out into the rural areas of Lloro, I bet the per capita income in some of those villages that Jesse and I visited was not 200 a month, but maybe 30 a month or 50 a month. Very, very low incomes. And so therefore, even those tier zero, tier one, tier two solutions are going to require financing. But these parties do not have access to capital markets. They don't have bank accounts. They don't have the things that we take for granted to enable us to buy things on credit. So where are they going to get the capital to invest 20% of their monthly income in a fan and a solar system to support a fan? So one of the major innovations that's occurred, financial innovations that's occurred to enable that, is what's called pay-as-you-go financing. Pay-as-you-go financing for these systems, if you remember back from a couple slides ago, what that tier zero or tier one solution involved, there's a device that has not only a battery in it and a controller in it with a switch, but it actually also is cell phone enabled. And what the energy access companies do is require that consumers make payments on a monthly basis for their service. And if they do not make payments on their service, the energy access company can send a signal to that phone or to that device, excuse me, and disable it so that the electricity goes out for that customer. Vice versa, if the customer does send a payment on time, the customer is given a code, usually by their cell phone. By the way, most people have cell phones even where they don't have electricity. And so the customer is able to enter the code into the device and give themselves essentially another month worth of electricity service. So pay-as-you-go financing has certainly been a key enabler, a major enabler of the energy access business over the past as it's evolved and emerged over the past 20 or 30 years, part and parcel or stemming from the adoption or the improvement in solar energy technologies over the past few decades. So you get a few years worth, at least a few years worth of free service out of it once you paid for it. And in fact, that's kind of one of the things that the energy access energy access businesses aspire to do is to have repeat business. They get their first light and their first cell phone, and then it gets paid off, and they go, oh, we want to expand, and so we now want to get a fan or a television, and so we want to add another couple solar panels and expand the size of the battery for that. So and by the way, that's kind of in theory, that's the path out of this poverty trap, this chicken and egg poverty trap of people can't afford electricity, so they can't get into the 21st century economy, so they don't get electricity, so they can't make any advancement in their standards of living. this it's not a overnight phenomenon for sure. It's a very slow phenomenon, but the theory is to kind of slowly grow the use of electricity and move beyond kind of basic electricity uses and hopefully beyond just mere entertainment uses to things that can start what are called productive uses, start generating incomes for these rural villagers, or improving the incomes that they're generating. For instance, if they're farmers and their produce can spoil, can we get them a refrigerator so they can keep their produce longer and generate essentially more income off of it? Um, that's the theory of these energy access businesses, that is a slow evolution of continuing load growth, such that eventually there's enough wealth in the community where maybe it becomes economically viable to build the grid that initially wasn't viable. I'll move to kind of our research interest, which is how to mobilize more capital to solving this, to supporting these energy access business and contributing to solving this problem. There's about $500 million per year invested in these energy access businesses around the world. And as you can see, that's grown from virtually nothing 15 years ago. But it's still a pretty small number relative to the 700 million people a year who don't have electricity in the true bottom of the pyramid. We're talking about less than $1 per person who's lacking electricity per year in capital going towards solving the problem. And if you look at the data, the the number of people who do not have electricity has declined pretty considerably from about maybe 15, 20 years ago. It was probably closer to a billion people without electricity 10 or 15 years ago. But it's plateaued. It's hit about 700 million people and just kind of flattened out. And given the United Nations development goal of one of the development goals is to universal access to electricity by 2030. Well, that clearly ain't happening. But it seems like of the billion people who didn't have electricity 15 years ago, 300 million of them have been solved, but maybe that was the low-hanging fruit. How do we get the remaining 700 million? And so that's really more capital is going to be needed for sure to get that done. So where's the capital going to come from? And this is a text-heavy chart. I apologize, but there are several categories of where several sources of capital that plausibly can be tapped to fill the gap that's needed to address the energy access issue more thoroughly. Equity investors of different flavors. You have obviously serious equity investors versus friends and family. They have different motivations and they have different return expectations. Commercial lenders are willing to, and in the case of the company we analyze, Soluz Honduras, are happy to provide commercial loans with market-based returns to fund things like inventory acquisition of product. So, that's certainly a key element to support the business. Development banks, of the various flavors underneath the International Finance, the World Bank and African Development Bank and Inter-American Development Bank and the European Development Bank. There are lots of development banks out there who are eager to sponsor economic development. They want to at least get some return on investment, although it doesn't need to be market-based. What's probably been another very interesting financial innovation in recent years, also enabled by kind of the digital world, is crowd lending. Kiva in particular is a platform that enables small, essentially donors from all around the world who are willing to say, all right, I'll invest 50 or 100 or $200, and with the expectation I get my money back, but I don't expect a positive rate of return on it. And then the once I get my money back, I'll keep reinvesting in deploying more capital out to the marketplace to fund acquisition for other underprivileged individuals. The second to last category is a phrase that's being increasingly used in the energy access arena and maybe throughout developing world philanthropy in general, called results-based financing. It's grants. It's money that there's no expectation that you'll get the money back. But the terminology results-based financing is basically to say the money comes in after it's proven that you've done the work. So it's kind of after the fact grants. So that's kind of a nuance of grant making that's emerged recently. And then lastly, I think it was Maxime who asked the question, customers participate in the financing of these products as well. And so what the company that, well, actually, before I get to that, what you have is a spectrum of different sources of capital with a spectrum of different expectations on returns. And now there's two dimensions of returns. There's the financial returns, which are, conventionally measured, easy to measure. Everyone understands how to think about financial returns. What's been more challenging is the second dimension, which actually has multiple subdimensions of non-financial returns. It could be environmental improvement, it could be social improvement, it could be at the individual level, it could be at the community level, but things that aren't providing a financial return to the capital provider, but are providing some sense of either mission alignment or warm glow that are creating positive impact that is what the money provider wants to see happen in this world. And so you have a frontier of different types of investors with different mixes of financial returns and non-financial returns that they're demanding. But the problem is that anything other than zero on the y-axis is really difficult to measure, conceptually difficult to measure, and even if it was reasonably straightforward conceptually to measure, probably difficult to measure in practicality just because of the cost of kind of acquiring and accumulating data from these rural remote areas is so high.
Richard, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can you just speak for a moment? What's the friction? I mean, as you laid out the story, it feels pretty compelling that there would be huge payoffs to giving this access to the last 700 million across a variety of players, right? So potential financial returns, 20%, right? High risk, but you're getting a pretty high return too. But even just from government standpoint of raising people's living standards, which I guess is getting to the non-financial, but that eventually converts to financial because as they become better off, then they can become a potential bigger tax base and all this other types of things down the road. I'm trying to understand the friction. What's getting in the way?
Well, I'll take a first stab at it, and then I encourage Nalin and Jesse to piggyback. Well, first of all, the governments in these countries don't have the capital or wherewithal to do it themselves. There's also corruption is a significant problem. The rules of the game are often skewed against these companies succeeding. These companies meaning the energy access businesses. But I think, I think our main point is that one of the frictions, it may not be the only one, but one of the frictions is, and I'll address it with the next slide. If I'm an investor on the next slide here, the left-hand side, if I'm thinking of putting $50 into Kiva, and someone from this household, and the way Kiva works, by the way, for those who aren't familiar, a particular household in a particular developing economy saying, we want $50 for a solar light. And so if I were to click on Kiva and if I were to click on that particular family and they're looking for $50, my decision is definitely impeded, if not prevented, by saying, well, how do I know, first of all, that the $50 is going to go to them? So there's kind of a capital efficiency question. But then the second question, and I think it's the one that Nalin, Jesse, and I are interested in, is how do I know that the $50 is really going to improve their lives? What is a $50 towards a solar light? How does that make their life that much better? And maybe it does, but it's sort of like it's hard for me to gauge the impact. And then, on the right-hand side, if we're talking about bigger dollars, if I'm a major philanthropy, if I want to give out a grant or support an energy access business with a couple $100,000, um, how am I going to, and let's say I'm interested in economic development. How is, funding work in this village for a year or two or three for a couple $100,000 or $500,000? How quickly is that going to start translating to true economic development, where the per capita GDP in that village goes from $300 a year to $800 a year to $1,200 a year? The government's not going to collect data on at that level of granularity. And so I think a lot of these philanthropic donors would be very interested in sponsoring uh, uh, kind of work of that realm if there was any proof that it really does lead to an acceleration of the economic development or quality of life. If the gradient on that slope over time increases. So Jesse and I traveled to Honduras in June to witness firsthand how a company called Soluz Honduras tries to solve this problem. Soluz Honduras is founded by Richard Hansen, who graduated from Questrom, 45 years ago with an MBA, and he's been spent most of his time since then working in developing economies in this energy access field. In 1994, he founded Soluz Honduras to focus specifically on the Honduras market after working quite a lot in Dominican Republic and elsewhere in the world. He was attracted to or encouraged to get into to Honduras by the World Bank. They said that would be a good market for him to tackle. So he created Soluz Honduras. It's headquartered in one of the main cities of Honduras called San Pedro Sula. But its current main project or program that it's working on is in this black outlined region called Yoro. Yoro is essentially a state within Honduras. It's a relatively poor state. Well, the whole country is relatively poor, to be honest. But the Yoro is below average for Honduras. And then within Yoro, there are some regions of Yoro that are really, really, really disconnected and remote from today's world. They're very, very, very difficult to access. And as you can see from this map, many parts of Honduras have extremely low levels of electrification. So we visited to see how these tier one and tier two solutions were provided to customers all the way into the last mile out into these very remote places. And we got a good understanding from that visit of their capital stack, which is, it involves at least the following elements. It involves equity investors, mostly friends and family, who are getting a warm glow from supporting Soluz, and then the prospect of some kind of future upside in the company. And that's been used to kind of get the business started and to occasionally inject capital for working capital purposes. As I mentioned earlier, they really don't have too much problem finding commercial lenders to buy inventory, and those terms are fairly standard for a small business working in a developing and world economy. Admittedly, I mean it's a pretty high risk environment in the sense that there's been, I think he said, two coups during the last 30 years, and so the rule of law there is not always what we would like to see in the developed world. So the market level returns, it's still probably on the order of 10-12%. So it's not cheap capital, but it is market-based returns. Kiva is the source of the capital for the PAYGO arrangement. So in other words, Soluz obtains capital through Kiva to fund an individual project. An individual project will then be financed over 24 months with 2% per month. And when those loan payments come back from the customer from the monthly payment, that funds or repays, I should say, those who contribute via Kiva. In addition, they have philanthropic donors who are who are basically per customer $50, actually it's $100. I think it's $100 of the $250 per customer. It's a discount to reduce the upfront price that the customer has to pay. The customer I'll talk about in a moment pays an initial price. So there's a grant to buy down the cost of the initial payment that the customer has to make, and there's also a buy down of the cost that Soluz bears by going out into the middle of the rural countryside to reach these customers, to market to them, and then to install and install the product for the customer. And of course, these are donors who are looking for the warm glow from helping that household. Then lastly, the customer themselves, as I mentioned earlier, are going to pay up front, and then they're going to pay over time at 24% a year, basically, interest rates. So they're looking for an improved quality of life. And in addition, they are spending money on things that they're displacing. So, they're not going to be buying as much candles. They're not going to be buying as many, AA and AAA batteries for their radio or whatever. So they are going to be saving money on a month-by-month basis, certainly after they pay off the loan for the product. So it's a pretty complex set of capital from different providers for different purposes that needs to be put together. And this took a long time for Soluz to figure out how to do this, and they're still trying to improve it, frankly. So it's a pretty costly and complicated part of their business to make work. Nalan and I were talking yesterday that you could say that Soluz is actually composed of three businesses. They are a marketing business to market and to get customers. They are a logistics company to acquire product from overseas, get it into Honduras. Not easy, by the way. And then sometimes they have to fabricate things to make the mounts for the solar panels on the roof. Those are pretty straightforward businesses. It's the finance business that is a challenging one. So why we're doing this work? Soluz is a friendly company for us because it's run by an alumni. He's been a great partner. But what we really want to do is compare Soluz to other companies who've been able to make this energy access business work, which is not easy elsewhere in the world, to see how the capital stack needs to be altered and amended depending upon where the company is working. And so that's really where we wanted to go with this conversation and I'm going to skip this slide. By the way, we did a blog post that is on the Marota website, and basically saying that it's the non-financial impacts that are difficult to measure that are making it challenging for these energy access businesses to succeed. We want to have a research program in energy access that helps increase capital flows to energy access businesses around the world. And we think that coming out of that research program ultimately would be stuff that we can use for teaching at Questrom and maybe elsewhere if we license it. But more importantly, to really help the energy access marketplace, both the entrepreneurs who are developing energy access businesses, as well as the capital providers who want to fund or support this line of commercial activity. How can you more tangibly, concretely, robustly, while maintaining simplicity and low cost, measure impact on the non-financial measures of interest? To the extent that we become seen as kind of thought leaders on this, we think there's an opportunity to communicate those learnings to the energy access marketplace, both the entrepreneurs as well as the finance community. And then lastly, the final bullet, Nalan and I have talked about this. We think that if we can figure this out better, we might be able to develop a fund for energy access that will be much more knowledgeable and insightful and nuanced in thinking about risks versus rewards, not only financially, but also impact-wise. More specifically to your question, Arvind, the first project that the next project, the first project, the next project that we're anticipating building off of what we've done this summer is to try and figure out how better to measure non-financial impact. And to do that by not just looking at Soluz, but finding a cohort of other companies like, comparable to Soluz, companies that have been around for, more than a couple of years, a decade, a couple decades, who have gone through boom and bust and then had to pivot several times and struggled at various junctures, but they've somehow survived. For each company in that cohort, if we can find a handful, say five, try to understand what they did in terms of developing a blended finance capital stack. Try to understand what how their customers view the improvements, the impact that the quality of life has had due to obtaining solar electricity. Try to understand the macro level impacts that the business has created. And then from having case studies of each of these companies in the cohort, synthesize across the cohort to develop a cross-sectional set of conclusions on what are the common elements of success across these successful businesses, where success is defined as surviving, not necessarily becoming NVIDIA in value, but in terms of they've been able to literally survive and return enough to investors to keep in business, but also to identify what differences in the business model and the capital stack need to be structured depending upon whether we're talking about Honduras versus Zimbabwe versus Pakistan versus pick Laos, whatever, or versus Ghana. How do you have to adapt the capital stack depending upon where in the world this company is working? And then lastly, from all of that, how would we better measure and document impact on the non-financial metrics? So to specifically to your question, Arvind, we would like to take this research that we've done so far and say, okay, how do we build upon it and develop a much more pan-global view of how the energy access business should be financed with the various different capital slivers that are available from different parties with very, very different return expectations and demands. So that's the end of my presentation. I see we only have 5 minutes left, but obviously I'd love to turn it over to the room to discuss